right, well, we'll get started here. My name is Ryan Stenjum. I'm an environmental engineer with the city of Fitchburg. We're here tonight to talk about the name of the study is Flooding North of Dunn's Marsh, or also I've referred to it as the Crescent Road Stormwater Study because we're looking at primarily flooding along Crescent Road. Ben Schulte, the other environmental engineer with the city, is here tonight as well. We're kind of the primary contacts for the project. If anyone is watching a recording of this later and wants to reach out with questions or comments, you can find us on the city website, and Linda will share some contact information in a minute. So I guess the history here is several times in the last couple of years, there's been significant stormwater flooding along Crescent Road. Last year, the city budgeted to complete a stormwater study to look at the feasibility of some different alternatives to address that flooding. And this summer, we contracted with AE2S engineering firm to complete this study. And in the last couple of months, we've done some data collection and completed some initial modeling work. And then I guess the other thing to mention is, we're sort of still a little bit in the fact gathering stage of this study. So not talking solutions quite yet. And then also, I know there is also proposed resurfacing project on Crescent Road. This isn't the focus of that, though we may, depending on how things go here, try to piggyback on that project if there are some kind of construction alternatives that we can leverage or into the flooding solutions. So I'll hand it over to Linda Severson. She's with AE2S, the consultant who's completing the project. She's the project manager.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm Linda Severson. I work at AE2S. I'm here with my colleague Anne-Marie Kirsch, who also works at our company. And as Ryan mentioned, we're here to talk about the flooding that happens at north of Dunn's Marsh on Crescent Road. So over the past about decade, kind of an uptick in flooding has been observed, specifically kind of at the sag on Crescent Road, which is located north of Dunn's Marsh. And many of you may remember the 2016 event that caused these pictures to happen, where specifically the road sag had a fair amount of inundation on it, and there was some overtopping of the road south into the marsh. The area that was hit the hardest was that stretch of street between Equity Lane and Red Arrow Trail, which I have highlighted here in red. But there was also some damage to the city infrastructure. Renaissance Pond, which I have pointed out here, has a bioretention facility on the southern end, just north of Crescent Road. And during both the 2016 and the 2018 events, the embankment just north of the road blew out. And some private infrastructure was also affected. The Megan's Bay condos, which I have highlighted in yellow here, south of Crescent Road, in both the 2016 and the 2018 events, both had flooding, first floor flooding on the structures. The picture on the left here is the parking lot that's currently located between the condos, and that was the 2016 event. And you can see that there was significant flooding and overtopping that happened as water found its primary route of flow between the condos and discharged south to the marsh. So why are we here? Quite simply, to come up with some ideas on how we can improve the drainage and reduce some of the flooding that occurs. I mapped out the project schedule a little bit. Back in 2021, the city requested that consulting firms propose on this project to come up with the existing conditions model to evaluate what the current flooding is, as well as to come up with some alternatives to how to reduce the flooding. And we were selected as the firm to perform this analysis. And so Late summer and the fall, we basically went through a data collection period where we got some additional data, some survey data. We looked through record drawings and tried to complete the picture of what's happening at the site. And we developed an existing conditions model to use as a tool. And I'll be presenting that at the end of the presentation. But here we are right now at the first public involvement meeting. And it's important to us, no matter how we model the system, we won't get it 100% correct. So it's important to us to get public feedback and input to validate some of our results and ensure that the results that we're getting are correct. So we'll use any input that we get from this meeting to help refine the model through the beginning part of the year. We'll start evaluating some solutions, and we'll meet back with you folks probably about the end of February, early March to discuss our solutions, and then we'll document and wrap up the analysis portion of the report or of the project in the first quarter of the year. So as I mentioned, input is valuable to us. We don't have a huge crowd here, but hopefully some people are listening or watch the recording. I have listed Ryan's contact information, both his email address and his phone number. And whether you have questions or input or observations or photos that you'd like to share, those are all helpful in this project. Additionally, the city has all of their current projects listed on their website. I've included the URL that links you to the project's homepage. Or I also listed a QR code that should directly take you to the project site. So taking a little bit of a step back from this exact project, I wanted to touch on, why does flooding occur in a system? Flooding occurs when the underground infrastructure, the pipes, are overwhelmed. And I like to use the analogy of the Beltline. Many of you have been on 5 o'clock traffic, sitting there waiting to get home after a long day of work. And if you equate the Beltline to the pipe network, that's the system that's conveying the water or cars in this analogy. And when we have too many cars, backups occur. Similarly, if we have too much water in the system, it's going to start to back up, and flooding at the upstream end or downstream end can occur. When we look at Crescent Road, which on this map is right, it's not showing up, at the southern portion here. When you look at the pipe network or the storm sewer network in the system, a lot of that pipe is relatively old. It was built in the 80s, and fortunately, we have better tools and better ways of analyzing things than we did in the 80s. Also, a lot of the infrastructure that was in place was responding to development at that time, and since that time, there has been development within the watershed. Not only has there been development, but design standards for stormwater have also become much more robust and stringent through time. Something that was designed in the 80s didn't have the same risk tolerance factors of what they have to achieve today. And as many of you have heard in the news, climate change is happening. So not only is there more development in the watershed, there's more rain happening. If you look in the 80s, when a lot of that infrastructure was built, we were maybe getting about 30 inches of precipitation a year. If you kind of gear over to the right side of the graph, now we're seeing almost 40 inches. So we have a lot more water that we need to handle in our system. But it's not just the volume of water that we have more of. It's also how often these extreme events happen. Between the 60s and 80s, we were maybe seeing 2 events a year that were exceeding 3 inches in depth. Now we're seeing more of 8 to 10. Another reason that we may be seeing flooding in the watershed is when the system was designed back in the 80s, our way of engineering or designing them was much different. We had paper maps, we had hand calculations, pretty simplistic tools, and now we have computers to basically have more data input and output from that we can generate more exquisite results from. That's not the word I wanted, but when we're looking at flooding, it's not only the depth that we need to think about, we have to think about that duration. Certainly you can think of a 2-inch rainfall that happens over 24 hours, just that sprinkling rainfall that consistently happens through time may not cause the same flooding event as that 2 inches of rainfall that happens in a half an hour. But as engineers, we're always designing something to fail. Whenever we design, there's a certain risk tolerance that is okay, and there's going to be some level, or there's always going to be the bigger storm, the bigger event, the deeper storm, the more intense storm that we just can't design infrastructure for. Right now, kind of that acceptable risk factor is to design for what we call the 100-year storm event. And for this area, the 100-year storm event is about 6.7 inches that occur over 24 hours. I like to use the analogy of rolling dice when looking at probabilities for storms. A 100-year storm event would be like having a 100-sided die, and on one side, you would have that 6.7-inch storm, and on all these other sides, you have a smaller storm event or no storm event. And at any given time, you roll that die. That's the probability of having that storm. That's the risk factor that we currently design to. I hear from folks, well, I had 2 6.7-inch storms that occurred in 10 years. How can that be? It's a 100-year storm. You're telling me only one should happen. Well, it's probability, it's odds. There's a chance that I could roll that dice 5 times and be very unlucky, and every single time I rolled it, that 100-year storm would show up. Is it likely? No, but it could happen. So this is what we're thinking about when we're looking at statistics and frequency of storm events. In the beginning of the slideshow, I showed the pictures of the flooding that happened, and that happened in July of 2016. During that time frame, 4.3 inches of rainfall fell over 2 hours. If that had fallen over 24 hours, I would have said that's probably around a 10-year storm or a 10-sided die. But the fact that it all fell with such intensity, it actually was a 275-year storm, which, back to that dice analogy, one side of a 275-sided die was the probability of that happening. And then everybody around here knows about the 2018 event, where there was such significant infrastructure damage around Madison. In this watershed, we got about 9 inches of rainfall in 12 hours. That's a 2,000-year storm. So back to the dice analogy, if you had a 2,000-sided die and you rolled it, that storm happened. A lot of people would agree that that's many times our lifetimes and maybe too robust of a storm to design to from a cost-benefit analysis, which is why we designed to a much smaller storm event. So what will this study do? The first thing we want to do is we want to create a model, and we want to determine why there's flooding, where does it occur, and what are the causes of it. And then using that model we create, we'll have a tool that we can start bouncing ideas through. What if we increase the storm sewer here? What if we add a little bit of pipe here? What if we increase the inlets? That tool will help us evaluate what some potential viable solutions could be for the project. And the idea is that 4 inches of rainfall that occurs over 24 hours is pretty much contained within the pipe. And we also want that 100-year storm to not cause infrastructure damage. But I did want to reiterate that no matter what our findings are in this study, it's not going to fix the system to handle that 2016 or 2018 event. Those are just too extreme. It will help it. It will reduce the flooding, but it won't eliminate it. So now that we've talked a little bit about why flooding occurs and what the goals of the study are, I wanted to talk about the model creation. What I show up here is the watershed that drains right now to Crescent Road. A watershed is any area of land that drains to one single location. The watershed for Crescent Road is 369 acres, so it's pretty big. And we were lucky that the City of Madison has a couple ongoing watershed studies that they've been doing for the past few years. And one of them happened to be the Duns Marsh Watershed Study. We were able to leverage the existing model to refine it a little bit for our needs. Some of the changes to the model that we made, first of all, there was maybe more detail in the area of the model that was within the City of Madison than the area that was in the City of Fitchburg, just because that was the area that is under their jurisdiction. And they also had more area modeled than necessary for our study. But we used this model and we altered it a little bit. The first thing we did is we took some of their subcatchments and we broke them into smaller pieces of land. The purpose of doing that is so that we can get more detail in areas of the model that we're looking for detail in. The other change we made is all of the area north of Crescent Road had very little storm sewer included in the model. And since the focus of the study is to evaluate the capacity of the storm sewer, we needed to add that back in. And that's where we started to look through record drawings and get some survey data. And we ran the model and got some preliminary results. This is the 10-year storm event, going back to the analogy, chance of this happening on the 10-sided die. And what we found in our results was that the sag on Crescent Road got about 1 to 3 feet of flooding. This is a modest storm event. I mean, it's large, but it's not something that's unheard of. So we are seeing flooding there. But in that storm event, our inundation shows that the condos water did not flow through the condos and there wasn't structure inundation. We also ran the 100-year storm event, that 100-sided die, and what we found in that event, and this is what we typically design for, this is the risk tolerance that we typically design for. What we found is we are getting overflow from Renaissance ponds, probably more overflow than this if the embankment were to blow out, because this is showing the topography with the embankment in place. We're also finding that we are getting significant flooding on the road, and at this point, we're getting flooding between the apartment, or between the condos and down to Duns Marsh.
So from Renaissance Pond, there's not a pipe underneath Crescent Road over into the marsh there, is there? When you're saying it gets filled up and then it just flows over the top of the road?
That pipe is the City of Madison storm sewer outfall.
Oh, and okay.
So that's taking water from Madison and outlet, that right under where the Crescent Road label is, you're saying? Yeah, so that's, theoretically, that's all water from Madison, but that did contribute to the issues in 16 and 18, though, that the failure of that.
This biobasin has a field inlet, which accepts water and takes it into this pipe that extends all the way up into the city, and then it does go under Crescent, discharges into the marsh.
From a microphone
Thank you.
standpoint, maybe we should have, just for those online, do you want to just maybe repeat that, Linda?
Sure. The question was asked whether there's a storm sewer going under Renaissance Ponds, and Ryan had answered that there is a storm sewer going under. It's kind of an odd storm sewer because it notches down in size a little bit. It goes from 72 inches to 60 inches. It runs under the bioretention at Renaissance Pond, but there's also a field inlet which allows water from the pond to enter that storm sewer, and then that discharges out to, we'll call it Northern Duns Marsh. Another way of looking at that flood inundation is velocity vectors, which basically it's all these cute little arrows that show how the water is flowing through the system. And what we're finding is that area that is seeing the biggest flooding, that sag on Crescent Road, the water is getting there from 3 spots. And the first one is that overflow from Renaissance Pond. Water basically goes from Renaissance Pond to Crescent Avenue and then flows to the east to the sag. Another area of contribution is drainage down Renaissance Drive. Again, it flows south till it hits Crescent Road and then flows to the east. And then the third area of contribution is water that flows south down Red Arrow Trail and basically hits that sag point. So now that we have some model findings, again, looking at the next steps for this project, we want to finalize these results. We have a running model, but certainly it would be helpful to have more feedback from the public on what your observations are. We'll finalize that existing conditions model, and then we'll evaluate some solutions. And those solutions could be a variety or a combination of either increasing storm sewer capacity, adding some storm sewer. I know that a couple of those roads that drain south have no storm sewer on them at all right now, or adding some inlets to the storm sewer. Besides adding storm sewer capacity, we might look at maybe safe overflows or redirecting the overflow so that we're not getting it over infrastructure. And after we evaluate those alternatives, we'll meet back with you folks for a second public meeting to discuss what we came up with. And we'll document and write this up in a report. And tentatively, design is planned for 2023, and implementation is tentatively budgeted for 2024 to 2025. And from there, I'll open it up to any questions. Sure.
How do you set the 100-year standard for a storm given climate change? I mean, what years are you using as the standard?
That's a great question. We're looking at historic data, right? And so certainly if we were to take smaller chunks of historic data, like the last 10 years, to look at probability and statistics that might increase. I think it's the last
So
100?
there are records in Wisconsin that go back to about 1895.
Oh, there we go.
So we have 100 years of decent records. And obviously, the more data you have, the longer you can look back, you can kind of look forward. Sorry. We have about 100 years of record in the state of Wisconsin, especially in cities and larger areas. And the longer the record you have, whether it be on streams or rainfall, the better you can do a statistical analysis. But you're right, things are changing. And how do you address that change? Right now, in Wisconsin, there are a few things that are going on. One is a combined program with the University of Wisconsin, a lot of scientists, DNR, USGS, some other agencies. And they're really looking at this question. And the answer is, we don't know, right? So when we look at these things, we say, well, okay, we think, based on our best information, that the 100-year rainfall is 6.7 inches. But what happens if it's really only 5 inches? But what happens also if it really is 8 inches? And the idea is to look at the existing conditions, because we need to know how our systems work now, and we need to be able to evaluate what those changes are and what difference it's going to make down the future. So we generally will look at that, 6.7 rainfall, but we'll also do kind of a look at it and say, well, but what if we're, 30% the other way? Because in hydrology, it's not an exact science. Like, we can predict physically how water is going to flow through a pipe, but predicting how rainfall occurs and then how the land reacts to it and how that water gathers, that's really a lot less cut and dried. So that's why we say, well, when you pick the 100-year flow in this stream or in the storm sewer, you're hoping you're within 30% one way or another. So that's intrinsic to our analysis, is to say, well, but what happens at these other bounds?
We should note, too, that when I started as an engineer, what was considered a 100-year storm event is smaller than what's considered now. It's a moving target that they're continually updating. I know that Atlas 14 depths are planned to be updated again.
They are going through a process right now. And Linda touched on this earlier, too. We designed the infrastructure, so say the storm sewers and so on, for about the 10-year event, for that 10% annual chance event. And that's kind of a combination of economics, because it's not economical to put a pipe under a road that would carry that 100-year event. And that's why the street conveyance is considered part of that, because if you're getting that 4 inches of rainfall, I really hope you're not out driving on the road, because your windshield wipers are not going to work fast enough, and you're going to start hydroplaning, and that's a whole nother problem. But in regards to that, the streets are part of the conveyance system. But this safe overflow path is what we're really looking at for those large events like the 100-year, so that the water doesn't get trapped and that cars aren't floating away and people aren't having damage to the first floors of their homes.
Linda and Anne Marie, is there enough capacity on the other side of say, theoretically, I could get all the water across Crescent Road? Is there enough capacity there, in the ponds and in the marsh, that I'm not going to be flooding Seminole Highway or causing some other problem? Because that is a basin, it doesn't go anywhere.
So when we began looking at that, this is one of the things that we took into consideration, because certainly there could be a situation where Dunn's Marsh is very high and water can't hit that brick wall, and it backs up because of that. And so because of that, we made sure that we added and refined the watershed model that was developed by City of Madison to encompass all the volume of water that would go to Dunn's Marsh. So we know kind of that worst case scenario, which one's the driver. And what we found was Dunn's Marsh water elevation was a bit lower than the flooding. And so it wasn't a situation where we were getting back flooding from the marsh. It was actually water, and you can see it in that 2016 event. Water was definitely flowing to the south. It wasn't the opposite.
Just my observation, when they de-water the marsh for some work, there's not much, the water's only about that deep, you got hard pan that's filled in from vegetation over the years, that
Right.
if they needed more capacity, a dredging solution, I realize I'm talking crazy money, but there used to be a lot more capacity in that pond.
Right, but also think about how big the marsh is. So if
Yeah.
you get 6.5 inches or 7-8 inches of rainfall over the watershed, even if that's 16 inches over the marsh,
Yeah.
it's still not of an elevation that
I got you.
overtops back to Crescent Road.
But to answer your question, we do look at the downstream conditions. You just can't assume that the water magically disappears somewhere, and that is a very good point.
Yeah,
Right.
water's coming into from the other side of Seminole Highway into that also. But thank you for answering that question, Emily.
I got a question online from John here, and the question is, how does this interfere with Apache Pond? Is the question. John, if you're listening online, is there anything more specific to that question? Otherwise, we'll, I think, try to answer it as best as possible. I think Ryan.
Apache Pond is the one to the east,
Yep.
correct?
Correct. 2 ponds to the east, so
Okay.
there's a small one.
Right,
and
that's
then-
right, okay.
Right. It's a good question. I'm trying to understand if the question's geared toward like a water quality, or if hydraulically the question is it gets flooded.
Yeah, does the flooding ever
Get to a point. Gotcha.
inundate Apache Pond?
What we're seeing in our modeling results, at least, are that the sag fills up, and then once it hits capacity, it finds overflow routes basically through the condos. That's the relief valve, if you will.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there are pipes from Madison that are part of this watershed.
Yep.
Plus pipes from Fitchburg that are part of this.
Yep.
How do these two pieces work together? And, is Crescent Road just just putting up with having water from 2 large sources sort of coming down?
It is
to
the downstream end of the watershed, unfortunately. I have a better map than this.
The large City of Madison pipe goes underneath, though.
So anything, this kind of diagonal line you're seeing here is the divide, the belt line, and anything north of that comes through, basically through this large pipe that comes, I'm not able to get basically through this pipe that follows its way down and then goes under Renaissance Pond to the discharge. This area right here generally drains south, and part of that is in City of Madison and part of that is in Fitchburg. And so for our model, we basically detailed this section out and added the storm sewer so we could figure out, exactly what is coming to this area and how much is coming. And the idea would be, maybe this main line gets increased to take more water and bypass Crescent. Maybe additional storm sewer gets added upstream to capture it and get it off the road and under the road out to Dunn's Marsh before flooding at Crescent.
So,
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, Ren. I did get a follow-up from one of our viewers online, interested in whether there might be modifications to the Apache Pond.
That is not being considered as part of this project.
Great.
This project is focusing on stormwater conveyance to eliminate flooding at Crescent Road.
yeah, and I think Apache is far enough away from pretty much all of the immediate flooding on Crescent. I wouldn't say anything's entirely off the table until we've gotten all the way into the models, but I'd say it's not likely to be any modifications there at all. I guess what I was going to chime in on the City of Madison storm sewer pipe that Linda was elaborating on. I think so. The City of Madison is finalizing their study that they completed, and there was issues with that storm sewer certainly in 2018, when we had the really excessive rainfall, and I believe 2016 too, where there was contributions. The structure there failed basically, and there was water coming into the Renaissance Pond that should not have. The idea is it should bypass. So they've made some modifications there. They're completing their study, and I've heard there are proposed additional modifications to their system, but we haven't seen those yet. But at least we'll have, theoretically, we'll have a tool here that'll allow us to, with these stormwater models that AE2S has built, to do some different testing of solutions, and we can, if the city has their proposed solutions, we might be able to work with them, the city of Madison, that is, to incorporate that into our model. I think these are kind of parallel projects.
But there's definitely synergy between the solutions.
The reason I asked that is I was actually one of 5 people that showed up at the first Duns Marsh watershed meeting.
For the city of Madison?
Yeah. I mean, because even though I live in Fitchburg, I know it's a much larger watershed.
Right.
My understanding is that they were working towards putting in larger pipes that would
That is one
carry
of their
more.
alternatives.
But if that's all, if there's more coming down to Crescent Road, then
But that pipe doesn't hit Crescent Road, it goes under.
It goes under. It's
the
supposed to
marsh.
go completely
So
around.
the idea is to increase that conveyance underground, bypassing the system, so it's not backing up and failing to a point where now it is in Renaissance Pond and it's popping over the embankment and flooding Crescent. The idea is, let's get it all bypassed. And because it's City of Madison and City of Fitchburg, this is going to have to be a cooperative effort. Any other questions online or in the room?
Sir?
I had one, maybe this is more to Ryan. We have a relatively large undeveloped area yet. Most of the watershed is developed with the exception of the property behind Thermal Fisher that is being anticipated for development. Can you speculate, or is that set up there that more hard surface up there won't create future problems down here again, cascading effect?
I may defer some of that to Ben. I haven't reviewed those plans, but they should be required to meet all of our stormwater ordinances, which would include volume control and peak reductions, unless there's a regional basin that they're a part of that I'm not aware of. But yeah, so I think they should be controlling their stormwater on site and not, making our situation down on Crescent Road worse.
Anything online? Any other questions?
I'll just add, the city has, we received ARPA funding, and that's paying for, I believe, your work, to study this. And I believe also, there might be a solution phase, that some of that funding might be used to pay for that. Does that make?
The study itself we did not end up using that funding,
Okay.
but I think just for procurement reasons, but the construction side of things certainly could if when we've got a budget for that, it makes sense to use it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't have a question. I just want to make a comment that my husband and I love living on
Thank you.
Thank you. And if there are no other questions or comments, I think we can close the public meeting and thank everybody for your attendance and your attention. And we look forward to talking to you in a few months.